This video is just as much for Jordan Peterson's audience as it is for Jordan Peterson. I have already tried contacting him on X over the past year or so regarding some of this subject matter, and thus far he has remained completely silent about it. Although, yes, I am pretty fucking sure that he has noticed me. I've been blocked from his account, and as far as I can tell, it wasn't for saying anything that was offensive or demeaning. This was the last thing that I posted on his profile before being banned from replying. And it's a bookplate from an alchemical text that used to be owned by Carl Jung. So it should go without saying that it is relevant to his interests. Before we begin, I also need to note that this video is far from finished. The license to my video editor is going to expire soon. So I'm simply going to release what I have for now in the hopes that I will actually be able to do this topic justice later on. Seriously, this is not up to my usual standard. As it stands, it is poorly edited, and there is a very wide range of additional material that I didn't get a chance to cover on time. Anyways, let's get started. If both Peterson's profession and the illustrations in his books are anything to go by, then it is safe to assume that this motherfucker is part of what is known as the alchemical tradition. And the reality of this is the darkest thing that I have ever fucking known. Alchemy is known as a precursor to modern chemistry, but contemporary psychology has roots in this practice as well. In fact, these two professions seemingly go hand in hand. After all, what would a psychologist be without his medicines? The finer points of alchemy are part of a very diverse range of subject matter that Peterson won't speak about publicly because he is beholden to an oath. These pledges demand absolute secrecy in exchange for exclusive information. And because of this, the alchemical dream has seemingly always been to find a way to give their education to an outsider. This knowledge comes with many bindings, and indoctrinating an interloper is seen as a way to circumvent the oath. The way that they've decided to go about doing this is quite interesting, as it involves embedding subtle clues in a diverse range of media properties. The Freemasons that inhabit the arts have been incorporating elements of their cryptic education into their work for a very long time now. And this material collectively forms what can be accurately called a biblical Tower of Babel. That's biblical as in bibliography, and Babel as in Babel. This tower is somewhat ramshackle, but it is complete enough that it does indeed work. And the primary function of this metaphorical structure is to provide what Peterson calls a map of meaning. These motherfuckers have charted the inside of the snake bottle, and this collective task has been centuries in the making. In other words, you can use the Western media canon to figure out what the fuck is actually going on. In order to do so, you have to consume a lot of material, though. And you also need to be able to accurately interpret symbolism and metaphor. It is interesting to note that one of their most effective tactics has been to degrade the quality of contemporary work in the hopes that doing so will drive people farther back into the canon. I've found that the top of the tower doesn't actually have much depth to it. And in order to truly understand some of this stuff, you essentially have to go back to sources like the Bible and Shakespeare. Generally, though, these bastards have been employing what you could accurately call a clockwork orange strategy, as this involves keeping certain members of the population drugged in front of a television or computer screen, so that they may be subjected to an endless amount of Masonic propaganda that is disguised as art. And who are we kidding? This is actually happening to most of the people that make up the Western world in one way or another. The title of Jordan Peterson's most successful book is reminiscent of a tract written by occult author Manly P. Hall. Hall was a 33rd degree Freemason and an avid student of symbolism and religion. His work is quite credible, and I highly recommend reading his book, The Secret Teachings of All Ages, if you find any of this interesting. However, Peterson's work draws from another author that is much darker in nature, and that is of the alchemist Michael Meyer. Yes, that's Michael Meyer as in the fictional serial killer. And I'm pretty sure that that film character was named after this guy. It makes sense. Michael Meyer in his movie form is a psychopath that goes to the suburbs to slash up teenagers and young adults. And as we will soon see, the only difference between these two characters is that these great doctors are doing this psychologically instead of literally. Examples like the naming convention in this movie franchise are how the initiated operate. They sow little clues to their true background in the popular doctrine. And that's exactly what Peterson was doing when he decided to incorporate some of Meyer's artwork into maps of meaning. The general population is inside of what can only be described as an information quarantine. And Peterson illustrates this concept with what he calls the parable of the walled garden. This idea is nothing new, as it can be seen displayed prominently in religious iconography as well. The Garden of Eden is a pasture of ignorance, which is why partaking in the fruit of knowledge leads to one's exile from it. And the tree that bears this fruit is indeed guarded by a snake. But we'll get to that later. For the time being, this concept can be summarized by saying that Paradise is a book best left closed. In other words, it's just like that movie, The Matrix. Except instead of being housed inside of a computer simulation, those trapped within are being gated from knowledge. And it's ironic, but the key to freedom is actually contained within their digital devices. Most of this information is at least technically within the public domain. It's just very difficult to actually piece together, at least without the help of a cult like Freemasonry that is founded upon maintaining the illusion. Anyways, Peterson diagrams his garden with help from a drawing that has been sourced from a book by the aforementioned Michael Meyer called Atalanta Fugiens, which may very well be one of the most important works of literature that you have probably never heard of. Atalanta Fugiens is hard for me to completely make sense of on my own because it is an archaic work that is allegorical in nature, but it essentially contains what constitutes as a game plan for indoctrinating an outsider into the alchemical tradition. The education that these people were and are given is only available from the institutions of the establishment, and this instruction entails a more thorough understanding of the metastructure of our society. They are essentially shown how the system of indoctrination and control applied by it actually works. You can think of it as a view of the clockwork of our culture from the top down. In other words, this is at least technically similar to the education that was given to kings, which is remarkably different than the knowledge that was accessible to the subjects that they would govern. And the best part is that they just leave this sort of stuff lying around where basically anyone can get into it. This obviously wasn't always the case, but it definitely is now thanks to the digitization of some of these obscure old books. And if you think that these ancient control mechanisms have changed at all because of the Enlightenment era or something like that, then I have some very bad news for you. We are essentially under the rule of the same system of governance that was applied by the empires of ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Greece. This is what is known as the Babylon system. And religious connotations aside, this is a practical political model. It is basically the very same societal structure that is both held up by and disparaged within the Christian Bible. None of this bodes well for Western civilization, as these supposedly once great empires have all fallen. And all that it takes is a quick glance at the Western media on any given day to realize that we are headed in the same direction. I'd like to eventually make an entire video about the finer points of this system, as there is simply too much ground to cover in this singular installment. I can assure you, though, the actuality of it is really fucking gross. This education that I speak of comes with a binding pact of secrecy. And because of this, a plan was apparently drawn up to circumvent this without actually breaking the oath. And this involves deploying a methodology that is intended to initiate members of the general population into their sphere of learning outside of the influence of the institutions. And this is all attempted without the subject's knowledge or consent. This process is a brutal one, as these people can apparently only protect their official interests. And as such, it involves laying their collective boot down on a selected individual as hard as they can, in the hopes that doing so will enlighten this person to the true nature of their control mechanisms. And doing so is at least theoretically an act of resistance that looks like oppression to the rest of the gatekeepers. If the selected individual manages to survive this with their sanity intact, then it is hoped that they will eventually be able to piece together the true nature of the system at hand. As the public perception of how governance functions is civic propaganda that fails to account for the cryptic influence of fraternal orders like Freemasonry and the way that they help structure the society that we inhabit. To put it simply, there is a state religion that conceals its existence from the general population, and it uses its influence to keep the wheels turning on a grand lie. This is, of course, the walled garden that we were discussing earlier. And those that desire to break this system have decided that the best way to teach you of its machinations is to use them against you. If you are unable to feel your bindings, then you will never know that you are wearing them. But if you lean on someone hard enough, you will show them the true nature of their chains. This is essentially the political concept of accelerationism, except it's being done from the system within. Unfortunately, most of those that would tread upon you will do so with the utmost sincerity. If you've ever seen Full Metal Jacket and how Private Pile is singled out for abuse by the establishment, then you already have a pretty general idea of how this all works. And if you don't believe that they're willing and capable of doing this to someone in real life, then the ghost of Timothy McVeigh would probably like to have a word with you. This is what is known to students of alchemy as the application of vitriol, and this tradition is a Masonic one as well. This is essentially a form of psychology in which the collective tries to mold the behavior of an individual in a manner that is most befitting of the group as a whole. And societies do this naturally, but fraternal orders are well versed in how to consciously apply these techniques. The United States military actually has a very long history of conducting psychological experiments on those that it recruits.
A typical drill sergeant ordered his men to fall in. The squad, composed of volunteers for the test, responded like well-trained soldiers, immediately and without question. On the drill field, the men obeyed his commands accurately and with precision. A second drill sergeant assumed command. He put the squad through its paces capably. This man also proved to be an able drill sergeant, giving precise commands. 2 hours later, the squad, all except the drill sergeant, now drugged with LSD, again was ordered to fall in. The response was not the same. The squad leader thought it was not necessary for him to dress right. There was much laughter as the group attempted to give expression to inner emotions. This elation was group supported, and an individual who was separated from the group would show severe disturbance. Notice the volunteer who salutes several times. 5 minutes later, his severe depression caused the medical officers to end his participation in the test. Response and actions of the drill sergeant who did not receive LSD were as before. But in marching, the drugged squad, although starting fairly well, gave a sluggish and ragged performance. After a few minutes, the men found it difficult to obey orders, and soon the results were chaotic.
And the government itself is definitely not above doing the very same to civilians as well. And this is an international problem, as evidenced by the federal authorities' willingness to conduct these experiments outside of their jurisdiction. Some of the most unethical studies conducted by the MK Ultra program happened in Canada, which is of course the homeland of a certain psychologist that we all know and love. To be clear, I do not know if a straight line exists here or not, which is exactly why I would like to have a discussion with this man. Furthermore, the Meyer method includes almost total isolation from one's intellectual peers. The individual is placed into a sociological bottle of sorts and left to their own devices. And this is possible because academia and the arts are absolutely saturated with Freemasons. And they all typically do what they're told. So if someone outside of the group is branded as being socially off limits, then most of them will almost certainly comply. In other words, instead of collectively breaking their oaths as would be most efficient, these motherfuckers have decided that the best course of action is to create ideological radicals. This is done through media manipulation as well as sociological engineering, and this process rarely works. These techniques can probably account for the existence of people like the Zodiac Killer, Charles Manson, and Ted Kaczynski. And I am honestly unsure if any of these people specifically had the Meyer method applied to them, but it's definitely in their bag of tricks. The Meyer method is somewhat unique because it employs the use of a black widow, but we'll get to that later. And despite commonly playing around with things like cryptograms and symbolism, people like this are almost never directly on target. Furthermore, they've been attempting this sort of nonsense for centuries now, and thus far it has yielded them very poor results. Unless you really want to consider somebody like Jack the Ripper a success story. Atalanta Fugians is not the only book that contains a blueprint like this either, as there is an entire canon of similar literature. And the other pinnacle of this form can be found in a manuscript called Splendor Solace. And in its illuminations, we can find this portrait of an angel maiden leading a swamp man out of the bog of ignorance. She could also alternately be seen as obstructing his path. It's usually either or with this kind of material. And yes, this is apparently how the highly educated view certain members of the common population. The aforementioned maiden is what is known as a Hesperides. In Greek mythology, these are young women that are known as both the keepers of the sunset and the guardians of the orchard of golden apples. Both of these attributes symbolize the veiling of wisdom. And they carry out this task for their father Atlas, who holds the heavens upon his back, which is essentially a metaphor for state control. Hesperides are black nuns which serve a variety of purposes in both ancient religious orders and the modern cult of Freemasonry. And the gatekeeping of knowledge appears to be their primary purpose. To give you an idea of what to expect if you are targeted for this process, you will be approached by what is essentially a hipster girl that will send you a barrage of mixed signals that serve to confuse your emotions and derail your train of thought. And this works really fucking well. I can tell you from experience. This constitutes a very old game that's been played since at least the medieval era that I like to call Unicorn Hunt. And this is apparently done for the amusement of the royals as well as the liberation of the alchemists. They like to target rogue intellectuals and artists outside of the influence of Freemasonry. And in a modern sense, these operations are carried out by members of the Order of the Eastern Star, which is the Masonic equivalent of a women's auxiliary. Here we can see one of these girls cast in the role of Judith, whose duty is to obstruct Jacob's ladder from intruders. In case you don't know, Jacob's ladder is a symbolic representation of the biblical path to illumination, and it is indeed well guarded. To put it simply, these girls are indoctrinated into a cult that uses them as a way to safeguard against outsiders that have the potential to comprehend exclusive information. And apparently the hopes of both academia and the high church has been for someone to eventually catch one of these girls. And I'm pretty sure that I more or less did. These women are black widows, And we can see their process illustrated quite plainly in a text from the medieval era called the Book of the Holy Trinity. And it is a rather simple methodology in which a serpent harpy is equipped with a spear and then set upon what appears to be a naive couple in order to dissolve their relationship. A breakup can lead to ruin in more ways than one. And modern Freemasonry still deploys this tactic on people that they find undesirable both within and without the organization, usually without those affected ever realizing that the entire tactic was a ruse. It should be noted that simple membership in the Order of the Eastern Star is not enough to warrant this type of behavior. As with everything related to Freemasonry, it is a tiered system, and not everyone reaches its higher echelons. The Order of the Eastern Star is relatively recent in the general scheme of things. So I suppose that in the past, this sort of stuff was carried out by literal nuns. I'm not completely sure how all of this used to work, but there is a hidden history here that would be absolutely fascinating to discuss with somebody that actually knows it. Basically, if you find yourself getting too close to the truth of how the system actually operates, then you'll probably end up getting stung by one of these. The existence of these girls predates Christianity, and there is evidence that this sort of social engineering goes back to Egypt. This is found in the icon of Sekhmet, who was a guardian of the underworld. And the underworld in question is, of course, the cryptic education of the ruling class. Sekhmet's basic design can be seen echoed in the Green Lion of alchemical literature. And despite being produced in a different era entirely, Sekhmet's function is still the same, and has remained consistent for millennia. She stands atop the scroll of privileged knowledge, guarding it from anyone who would dare trespass it without permission. Christ is an archetype that can theoretically be adapted by anyone. And if one of these would be truth tellers decides to climb down off the cross that society has put them on, then they might just find a green lion waiting for them at the bottom. I made a whole video about my personal experiences with a particular green lion, and I definitely didn't have as much information as I do now, but it's worth watching anyways. I'll put a link for it in the comments. And yes, talking about this sort of thing, especially from a personal perspective, is embarrassing as fuck. And I'm sure it's probably intended to be like that by design. The point being, I am only doing this out of what I see as an absolute necessity. So, Jordan, with all of this said, am I reading the situation clearly enough? I do realize that a few of these details are probably inaccurate or not refined enough because I'm on the inside of the system looking out. But I'm pretty sure that I've got the general point down. Your audience is probably going to brand me as a wingnut if they even bother watching. And I know that you can't speak to me directly because of the oath and all, but it would help quite a bit if you were to post a picture of a unicorn or a bottle or something on your social media.